Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to George Washington University, and thanks for coming out in this nasty, kind of cold day. So today we're going to talk about human rights, accountability, and internet governance, the relationship between those three variables. And obviously that relationship is changing. So we're going to have a perspective from several different points of view. I would like to say that we could not do these events without the help of the Internet Society. The Internet Society has truly been our partner, and I'd like to call out David Viorst and John Moore for going out of their way to help us with these events. I'd also like to shout out to our sponsors, who are ICANN and an anonymous donor. So in any case, we're going to begin now. And before we begin, I'm just going to say that I hope everybody got this handout, which has the bios of our speakers, to facilitate time, which I know is precious. I'm just going to say their names and what they do, but you can read their very extensive, talented backgrounds. So our speakers, and this is in alphabetical order, will be Manu Bhardwaj, who is the Senior Advisor to Undersecretary Catherine Novelli. And if you do anything on internet governance, you have to know Manu. He is the world's expert. We also have Andrea Glorioso, who is the Counselor for the Digital Economy at the Delegation of the European Union to the United States. We have Ambassador David Gross, who's the former U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the U.S. Department of State. And now he is a partner at Wiley, Rein, which is a law firm that works on telecommunications issue. We have Robert Guerra, who is a civil society expert specializing in issues of internet governance. And finally, we have Danielle Kehl, who is a policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute, where she writes about technology and the intersection with human rights and foreign policy. And I am Susan Aronson. Somehow I always manage to forget to introduce myself, which is bizarre if you think about it, like I'm presuming that you all know who I am. Okay, so welcome. David?
One quick thing. The hashtag for today's event is hashtag HRANDIG.
HR.
ANDIG.
Yeah.
HRN.
And please do tweet about it
Okay.
if you can. We appreciate it very much. So the way we're going to do this event is I'm going to ask every speaker to respond to a specific question. And they have 3 minutes to discuss their answer to these questions. And I'm a nasty human being, so I will keep them to that. And then I'm just going to ask them 4 questions, which they can answer if they want. And then we're going to open it up to your questions, which should constitute the bulk of the time. So our first question is, what is the future of internet governance, and where will the action be? So we'll begin with you, Manu.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to ISOC and yourself for putting together this great opportunity to reflect as we end the year and start another year. I just want to briefly note how when this year began, everybody was calling, I think, 2014 as the year for internet governance. We had a number of major milestone events, whether it was Net Mundial or the ITU Plenipotentiary meeting, which just ended. And there was a lot of discussion about, how at the end of this year, we will have a better sense of the future for the internet's governance and all these issues. And we'll have, I think, made a lot of milestones and decisions. And in some ways that's true, and in some ways, it's clear that we still have a great deal of work to do as a global community and as stakeholders in thinking through the future of internet governance. For us, we are extremely pleased with the outcome of the recent Plenipotentiary Conference. It's worth further discussion, but we feel before the conference there was, of course, great concern that it might somehow undermine the successful multi-stakeholder approach. However, instead, we feel very strongly that the conference resulted in a clear affirmation of the existing multi-stakeholder internet governance model, and we feel like we have a lot of momentum now as we head into next year. And next year at the future, probably a lot of it will be a discussion of something called the World Summit on Information Society. We now are reaching the 10-year milestone for WSIS. We are lucky to have Ambassador Gross, who was our head of delegation 10 years ago and negotiated the original Tunis agenda. But that original Tunis agenda 10 years ago promised that we would all get together in 2015 and review our progress in meeting the WSIS agreements, and that it would be the UN General Assembly that would meet, which is of course the highest organ in the UN system, to discuss internet governance, where we are, how we've accommodated desires and concerns of developing countries and developed countries, and where we would take the future. I think a lot of next year will be focused on this WSIS meeting that will occur in December 2015. And before that, however, we'll have another opportunity to come together as a community, and again, this time in Brazil, for the Internet Governance Forum. Brazil hosted a very successful Net Mundial meeting. It was a great discussion about internet governance. It importantly occurred in the Global South, which is something that we rarely have an opportunity to do. And it was very successful in terms of securing consensus on a number of matters, with both principles and a roadmap for future discussion. I would encourage everybody to take a look at the Net Mundial outcome document. But I think I just briefly, in these opening statements, wanted to say that I think the future for internet governance in 2015, I think we should all become familiar with WSIS, what it means, what were the agreements that were laid down in WSIS in terms of creating the IGF, and what are our goals as a community for the WSIS review, which will culminate in December at the UN General Assembly.
Thank you, Manu.
You're very welcome.
Andrea?
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to everyone for being here, for having me here. I think that's kind of the future of internet governance is the €1 million question, which makes 1.2 something million dollars, I think. Less than it used to be just a few months ago, unfortunately. But I completely agree with everything that Manu said. I would just like to mention what I see as perhaps a few dynamics that after having been working on this field for several years and continuing to work on it, I think that they will be the main drivers of the discussion that we will be having, or they should be the main drivers of the discussions that we will be having the next few years. The first is that I think that by now everybody, save very few countries or very few organizations, have come to the conclusion that you cannot have a centralized internet governance. You cannot have one single entity that basically takes all decision on every single policy area or regulatory area which is impacted by the internet. That is simply not feasible. Even international organizations which seem to be going that direction have seen the light, let's put it this way. That, however, opens an issue, which is it's fine to say that, okay, we don't have a centralized entity to have this discussion, but then where do we have this discussion? If the answer is, well, we will have different discussion in different fora through different mechanisms depending on the particular topic, which is all right, then we will need collectively to develop much better mechanism for communication between these different organizations, whether they're private or public or a mix of them. And also we will need to invest a lot more into collectively, again, into capacity building for all those stakeholders, all those citizens, all those businesses, especially but not only in the developing world, which for whom, quite frankly, the idea of having a centralized body is quite attractive, because if you have a centralized body, you have one shop that you go to, and if you do not have many resources to invest into this kind of discussion, it's better to have one shop than 35 different shops. So that is something on which I believe we will need to work for internet governance to continue to be made of productive and multi-stakeholder discussion. The second dynamic that I think will be very important in the future of internet governance is a much stronger, and again, this is a collective responsibility, a much stronger dialogue between the technical community and the policy community. And by the way, by technical community, I do not necessarily mean what in the internet governance world goes by the name technical community. That's a quite precise definition. Internet governance wonks have all kinds of definition and all kinds of boxes where they like to put people and organizations. When I talk about the technical community, I'm talking also about businesses, startups, all kinds of people, which quite frankly, I mean, if you talk to any startup in Europe and you start to talk to them about WSIS or internet governance or ICANN, their eyes will glaze over in 5 seconds. It's simply not on their radar. Now, one might question whether it should be on their radar or not. I personally think that it should be on their radar, because the decisions that are taken in all these different fora do have an impact at the end of the day on their business. So we need to talk more. We as a policy community need to talk more to them, to engage them more. But also, quite frankly, we also need to learn from them. Because if there is one thing that I've been learning working in the European Commission for quite some years by now, is that it's very nice to come up with the regulatory ideas and the legislative proposals. But if technologically they don't work, you're just wasting your time and citizens and taxpayers' money. So it's not, quite frankly, technology, especially businesses, will always tell you that that particular idea doesn't work if it's not in their interest. Fine, that's how businesses work. But they can also teach, they can also share a lot of insights into how internet technologies actually work, what is possible, what is not possible, maybe what would be possible in 5 years or in 6 or 7 years. And that would be very informative for policymakers. So if I had to make 2 wishes, or 1 wish, on how I would like to see the future of internet governance is A, more capacity building and a better understanding of how this distributed kind of discussions could actually work, and B, a better dialogue between the policy and the technological community. I think these are the 2 priorities for all of us to work on.
Thank you, Andrea. Ambassador Gross?
David, please. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. It's great to be on the panel. I am very impressed by everyone swimming here today through the cold rain. That shows this is a hardcore group of internet governance aficionados, because it would be so much easier to stay at home or stay in your office. So we all appreciate your coming out. Let me take a slightly different tact, if I may, because I think I agree, not surprisingly, with the comments before me. I am now coming to the conclusion that internet governance is a historically interesting but not currently very helpful concept. It used to be important because the internet was a fairly defined, localized set of issues and challenges, particularly back during the days of WSIS, back in 2003 and 2005, when it was really the province of the developed world, and even within the developed world, it was really just Europe, the United States, Japan, and a few others. That's no longer the case. The internet now is, if not ubiquitous, it's close to being ubiquitous. The idea of internet governance is really about governance of everything now. And once it becomes the issue of governance of everything, trade, technology, political discourse, and so forth, it being viewed as a separate and identifiable thing, I think no longer really is very helpful. But rather, as Andrea pointed out, really the sort of, you need to be in a large number of places talking about a large number of issues in order to deal with these issues. And therefore, although I certainly agree with what Manu said, that the WSIS plus 10 review process will be critically important, and particularly about the issues that we're talking about, such as human rights and the like, will be teed up very strongly. Similarly, trade issues for the next year or so will be critically important on data flows, privacy, human rights, and the like. That will be a major place for the discussion of these issues. We'll have these issues discussed at the OECD as we get ready for a ministerial in 2016. We'll have these issues discussed bilaterally as we have for many years. They should and will, I feel confident, be a fundamental tenet of U.S. foreign policy, as they have since at least 2006, when then Secretary Rice created the Global Internet Freedom Task Force, and they've continued, as you all remember, with some terrific speeches by Secretary Clinton early on, and Secretary Kerry has appeared and endorsed the views of the importance of the relationship between human rights, internet policy, and the United States foreign policy. So as you look around, it is hard to find an area where the issue of rights, responsibilities, who gets to participate, about internet-related things don't occur. And therefore, the key will be to sort of focus on that which is important, but also take advantage of the ubiquitous nature of these issues and the fact that and the good news that they are important not just for the developed world as they were during WSIS, but truly have become universally important.
Thank you. Danielle?
Oh, sorry about that. I would also like to thank Susan and everyone for having me here. Very excited that you all did make it out in the rain. When I thought about the answer to this question, what came to mind for me first was that it sort of breaks down into two things. When we think about internet governance, the institutional questions in terms of where internet governance is going in the future, in terms of what institutions will be discussing issues, where we'll sort of see the interesting fights, perhaps one might argue, in 2015, and then the actual substance of the issues. What are people going to be talking about in these different places? So I think 2015 is going to be a very interesting year on the sort of the process and institutional front. Obviously, Manu mentioned the WSIS plus 10 review. We also have the IGF mandate expires, so there'll be another conversation about what the IGF is, what its role is, whether or not it can be expanded and strengthened, whether it should be made permanent or renewed again, which will sort of prompt a discussion about the role of that forum. We also have, which no one has mentioned yet, the IANA transition. So, back in March, the Commerce Department announced its intent to transition oversight of the IANA function to the global multi-stakeholder community. So we will, I think there'll be a lot of conversations about that in 2015, what that looks like. And in addition to sort of what's happening with these old institutions, we're going to see new things pop up. So I think the biggest one that I would bring up is the Net Mundial initiative, which takes the name of the conference that happened in Sao Paulo in April, and then sort of with a group of organizations, including ICANN and the CGIBR and the World Economic Forum, sort of looking to create another platform or forum to discuss a lot of these issues. And I think there are a lot of questions about what the role of that organization will be, or platform, whether or not different stakeholders will participate in it, and how it fits in the existing ecosystem. And as I think Andrea mentioned, there are already quite a few places where internet governance is being discussed, and already questions about what issues belong where. So sort of from the process sense, I think there'll be a lot happening in 2015 to look at. Substantively, of course, there'll also be not just questions about where certain issues should be discussed, but what are being discussed. And I think two of the big issues that have dominated the conversation in 2014 will continue to exist, and those are questions about surveillance and privacy and human rights, and questions about net neutrality, which is obviously something that we're discussing here in the United States right now, but is also coming up around the world in various countries, and then it sort of becomes an issue when you get to places like the ITU and the recent Plenipotentiary Conference. So I would say that internet governance in 2015 is heading in a lot of different directions with a lot of different processes, which I guess is a very broad answer, but I think that is actually kind of where we are right now.
Okay, a lot going on.
Great. I'm Robert Guerra. Susan, thank you so much for inviting me to this, and thank all of you for coming to the session. Speaking last on a topic like this makes it hard for me to include some original things, but I'll maybe add on and emphasize a couple things that were mentioned by some of my other colleagues. I'll focus on the one that I'm maybe more involved in, that I see as something that, given congressional dynamics, will perhaps is not being as discussed as it should, and that's the IANA transition. It was mentioned that this is a key initiative that really the U.S. and other stakeholders globally are trying to move. I think what's going to be the challenge is just trying to figure out the perception internationally of what the IANA transition meant, and then the political reality on the ground here in Washington, depending what happens on other issues over the next couple of weeks or a couple of months. And I think the issue of capacity building, I think, is key, because I think the discussions are going, I would say, in a very quick way. I think there is a disconnect between some in the policy technical community, particularly those outside the U.S., in terms of what's going to be happening here or not in the weeks to come. And so it'll be interesting to watch how that space can be protected in a way from larger issues here as well. And so I think that is a space worth watching. Isn't a specific meeting, but I would say over the course of this week, for those of you that are interested, there is a substantive meeting that one of the working groups that's working on the naming functions will be meeting, and I'm happy to tweet out information on that, but that will actually start on Wednesday. I think what's WSIS plus 10 is also taking place during MDG plus 15, and to see to the extent one of the original goals of the WSIS, which was capacity building and bridging the digital divide, whether that in fact will be taking place. And one of the issues that was also discussed at WSIS that kind of has been lost and coming forward was also financing the digital divide. And as we're in a more precarious global economic situation, how the perceived issues related to finance will be there. So I think that's something worth, I think, following. To Andrea's point, I think it'll be interesting to see what linkages are made to small and medium business in regards to these larger global processes that are taking place. For some, maybe ICANN is closer, but the larger IG processes, as long as they have a stable environment and they know what's going forward, is key. So I would say, from my view at least, the IANA transition and how that happens when the RFP comes out for the community to take a look at in January. The WSIS plus 10, I guess it's in the fall. And then how the different regions will be reacting to what's happened in Busan and their reactions to or not to how the U.S. Congress takes on the IANA transition. So those are my kind of quick comments on this. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. So we've heard that 2015 is going to be an important year. There's lots of new players who need to become aware, new players who are becoming aware, new institutions and organizations, new dynamics, some of the same old issues, some new issues. So I'm going to ask you a different question then. How can we reconcile the United States' privileged role in Internet governance with America's strong, albeit occasionally inconsistent, advocacy for transparent, accountable governance? So a very broad question. Who would like to answer that first? Okay, Manu.
You know, with any privilege comes great responsibility. And the United States has really focused this year on trying to expand the role of Internet institutions in policymaking, and also expand access to those institutions from the developing world, from civil society, from business stakeholders, so that we can really promote these Internet institutions, whether it's ICANN, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which often will develop standards, whether it's the IGF, which is often a venue for discussion of international Internet-related public policy issues, or the World Wide Web Consortium. These are the types of organizations that we have found have facilitated the stunning success of the Internet. And because of these institutions, the global economy is now functioning today in rapid, efficient, and multi-directional ways, with cross-border data flow increasing all over the world at record levels. And so from the US vantage point, we want to really support these Internet-focused institutions to help foster the Internet ecosystem's continued growth. And one of the ways that we improve it is to make them more accountable. And you can make an institution accountable in a number of ways. One way you can make it accountable is just increasing the number of stakeholders who can participate in that institution. And certainly that, I think, we are seeing happening. So to give you an example, ICANN meetings today are attended by very senior levels of government from other countries, which is fantastic. So you have ministers of the world that might now attend a GAC meeting or the ICANN high-level meeting, which just recently happened in London. What that showcases is that they are coming to ICANN with their problems. They want to work through the ICANN system to kind of address issues. They want to kind of work in the multi-stakeholder process. And there's a certain level of buy-in that's really exciting about that. And so for us, it's a real win-win when these Internet-focused institutions become more inclusive, more accountable to not just the US, but to all stakeholders, all countries, where when they reach a position that they're viewed as a forum for real discussion and problem solving. And so for us, I think that we feel that there's an advantage for everybody, and that these are the institutions that have also that should be credited for the rapid rise of the Internet's benefits, both economically and the benefits societally that we've all experienced. So that's an initial take on your answer.
Can I press you a little bit
Yes,
on that, Manu?
go for it.
But you also have been talking about the free flow of information being regulated by trade agreements, and many people perceive trade agreements as negotiated in a not transparent and accountable manner. How would the U.S. government reconcile that?
Well, sure. I mean, I think cross-border data flow is probably one aspect of trade. And so one way to think about it is that currently the annual growth rate, if you think about in 4 years, the annual growth rate of cross-border data flow was 49%. That is far above the mere 2.4% increase in trade in goods and services during the same time. So there's something that's working in the internet economy that is quite remarkable. And I think that it's true that a lot of times trade agreements are not negotiated in multi-stakeholder, but I think that what we're talking about when we talk about cross-border data flow is slightly different. And I think it's benefiting, and we're all benefiting so much because it is more open, more participatory, more transparent, and that has profound benefits for us all as consumers and users of the internet.
Thank you. Andrea, would you like to address that? So the question again is the U.S. privilege role.
I think that we have, first of all, to agree on what privilege means. And I'm saying that because I, again, having worked in this field and also in other internet-related fields for quite some time now, and very often engaging U.S. stakeholders and the U.S. government, even before I came here to D.C., my impression is that sometimes people misinterpret the notion of privilege with the mere fact that the U.S. has been a first mover. The U.S. has decided to invest, both industry and the administration has decided to invest into the internet way before other parts of the world decided to do it. And does that make the U.S. privileged? I think that makes the U.S. A model to emulate, to be very honest. Now, having said that, there are, of course, situations, there are scenarios which are existing today in which the U.S. does have a slightly different role than other countries, and I'm thinking specifically about the relationship of the U.S. with ICANN and the so-called IANA contract. But there as well, I mean, what we have seen, as it was mentioned by one of the speakers before me, the U.S. government has taken I think we have to recognize the quite courageous and brave decision to unilaterally start the process that will lead to the end of this specific relationship between the U.S. government and ICANN. And I would like to say that for anybody who has been working in governments, or let me rephrase, anybody who has not been working in governments probably does not realize the amount of fights, I'm pretty sure, that took place within the U.S. administration to reach that decision, and the amount of courage that political decision took. In fact, as you might be aware, the European Commission, I think 4 hours after the press release of the Department of Commerce announcing the start of the process that will lead to the end of the IANA contract, the transformation of the IANA contract, the European Commission officially congratulated the U.S. government. And I remember that because it was 2 a.m. of my night when I wrote the press release, and it was the day before my birthday, so I remember very well that particular night. I must admit that I'm not entirely sure that I personally see a privileged role of the U.S. government in other fora or in other organizations where internet-related matters are discussed. And by the way, I completely agree with David that maybe the term internet governance is starting to become a bit oldish, and we should change our language because these issues are by now discussed everywhere, including organizations which have no idea what internet governance means, what is the meaning of that term. What you have is that you have a big country with a very strong economy, which is looking after its self-interest, as every single country does, and which is defending its interests in all these other organizations. Now the question is, can we align, speaking from the perspective of Europe, which is my job, can we align the interest of Europe and the US in this particular field? I think, and here I feel that I can talk on behalf of the Commission, that there is a lot more in common in this particular field, also in pushing for accountability. There is a lot more in common between Europe and the US than between, I would say, Europe and other parts of the world, and that is something that we should build on. Susan, if I had to be honest, I'm not entirely sure that I see, but that might be my eyes problem. I don't see a direct link between the supposed privileged role of the US, which again should be qualified in my opinion, and transparency. I think these two issues are separated from my point of view. It is not up to me to judge whether the US government has been coherent or not in advocating and implementing transparency. That's for others to say. I think the European Union, in matters related to the internet and others, including in trade agreements, which you have mentioned yourself, I think we have been doing a lot and what is reasonable to be done when you are discussing anyway matters which have a dose of confidentiality in them, and trade negotiations have a certain amount of confidentiality which is embedded into the fact that you're negotiating with someone that does not necessarily share your own interests. That's the point of trade negotiations. Can we do more? Yes. Can we learn more about the way that internet discussions are conducted? Yes. On this, however, let me just, and this is on the basis of professional experience over many years, let us not confuse total openness with transparency. The fact that the process, a discussion process, is nominally open, which is theoretically everybody can participate, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is completely transparent, for the simple fact that many people will not have the resources to follow the discussions. And working in the Commission, I know that I'm being video recorded, so I'll be very careful in what I'm going to say, but we are accused sometimes of multiplying the different streams of discussion in order to create chaos and confusion. I'm not saying this is what we do. Actually, I can say that this is not what we do. But in the internet world, you do sometimes see plenty of discussion. They're all public. You have 25 million lists, 30,000 people participating in the discussion. Is that really transparent? Are we really building the capacity that is necessary for every single citizen of the world to potentially participate in those discussions? That is the sort of question that maybe we should ask ourselves. And that, again, is quite irrespective, in my view, on the supposed privileged role of the US in this environment.
Thank you for those comments. Would anyone else like to comment on that question? Okay, let's move on to another question. So the internet, as we all know, is governed by multi-stakeholder groups to some extent. Are governments privileged stakeholders of the internet, or stakeholders just like any other? And if governments are no more privileged than other groups, how can we keep the current multi-stakeholder balance?
Susan, can you turn your microphone on?
I thought it was on. Sorry. So again, are governments privileged stakeholders of the internet, or stakeholders just like any other stakeholder? And if so, if they are no more privileged than other groups, even though they may be trying to move discussions of the internet to fora where only governments participate, how do we keep the current multi-stakeholder balance if more and more of these discussions are moving to venues such as the WTO? Ambassador Gross?
David.
Sorry to be formal.
It's okay. Yeah, that's right. It's such a too many Davids in here. That's the. I guess the question I would peel that question a little bit deeper, if I may. It has long been the position of the U.S. government, for one, of endorsing the multi-stakeholder approach for internet governance. But having said that, I think it should not go unexamined. So I think Assistant Secretary Larry Strickland has been probably the most articulate spokesperson of recent times about the importance of multi-stakeholderism and the core and the benefits that come from a decision-making view, as he's expressed it. And one that I think is widely applauded, certainly here in the United States, and I would say in Europe and elsewhere as well. Having said that, I think it's still a minority view, at least outside of the United States. Perhaps, and probably most likely because, as we've all talked about, the fundamental importance of the internet to economic, social, and political life globally now, I think it's fair to say that most governments believe that they are uniquely positioned, if not in a privileged position, in a multi-stakeholder way, perhaps to be the primary mechanism for deciding what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, at least for the people in their countries, and globally through multilateral institutions and the like. So, for example, I believe that the U.S. delegation did an extraordinarily great job at the recent ITU plenipotentiary, dealing with many of these issues, and particularly some very strong frontal attacks from those who have a fundamentally different view of what we think is appropriate from a governance perspective. Having said that, at the ITU, it was agreed that the ITU's Council of Internet Governance, this Council Working Group on Internet Governance, will be a government-only entity that will take inputs from outside, but in fact will continue to be. Something that Brazil, a country that has a very strong sense of a multi-stakeholderism, back at the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, very much supported in its proposed draft Opinion 7. It got basically what it wanted in draft Opinion 7 at the ITU plenipotentiary. Whether this turns out to be good or bad, time will tell, but it is not a ringing, in my view, a ringing endorsement of what Larry Strickling put out as a multi-stakeholder, where all come as equals, not as supplicants, not as inputters, but rather as equals to the process, bringing with them their expertise and the like. The same thing with regard to the WSIS plus 10 that we've been talking about. That will be done with inputs from all stakeholders, which is a very positive thing. But that was true back in 2003 and 2005. There were inputs from others as well. But like in 2003 and 2005, the process next year will be an intergovernmental process at its core. It is a UN classic intergovernmental. I could continue to sort of tick down these things. My point is really a limited one, which is that as the internet has continued to grow in importance and its global reach and impact, do not underestimate the importance of governments, the power of governments, and the central role that governments will play with regard to these issues going forward.
Would anyone else? Robert.
Sure. Let me just make a couple of comments, and I think it's just more maybe to get a discussion going on this as well, too. I think going back to the previous question, and given what you just mentioned, David, I think maybe 2015 will be the test of the model. Because what we're seeing is during this process, there's two things that we've always heard. Is one, that the private sector builds the infrastructure and runs the infrastructure, and that governments represent the individuals that use the technology. And so where we are going to be in 2015, and I guess, is whether governments are going to walk the talk and allow the multi-stakeholder to take fruit, not only here but in other places or not. And so there's been, Brazil, talks a lot about the multi-stakeholder model, but a lot of times at homes and other proposals, as you mentioned, that they put forward, don't necessarily get it as right as others would. And so I think that, what I'm interested to seeing and kind of going to the question is, one, what are we going to see? And so our government's going to open the door, but also build the trust, but also show the model working or not. And I think that, as has classically been the case when we talk about this broader issue, is if we're talking at a global stage, then what's going to happen to the countries in the middle? Not, we have the like-minded group that get the model right. We have countries on the other extreme that have very different points of view. And I think that's where we're seeing some very interesting challenges ahead because of developments both in the U.S. and also domestic national security issues. We have an increased securitization in many parts of the world, including Africa, where governments are asserting control of the infrastructure. There are reports, going back to kind of internet freedom issues a bit, which is an issue I've worked on a lot, is are we going to be able to have the multi-stakeholder model not only work here, where I think there is a general understanding, but I think in other parts of the world, and that's the big challenge. I think that's where we all together must work to make sure that they don't move in another direction, because if it's only open to governments and the majority of the governments don't move in the right direction, despite what may have happened in Busan, then we may have a very different internet 10, 15 years from now, and that's a worry.
Andrea.
I would love to see it.
Danielle.
Sure. I would just add quickly, I think the challenge is, again, sort of going back to the fact that there are so many institutions and processes, is that many of them are open to all stakeholders to participate on an equal footing. And whether or not that's always true, whether or not some bodies are dominated by members of the technical community or some are preferred by civil society, is doesn't mean that people can't participate. But the fact that there are institutions like the ITU which exist purely as intergovernmental institutions, and so to participate in the plenipotentiary meeting, you have to go as a member of a government delegation. And that doesn't mean that, I was there on the U.S. delegation as a member of civil society, but I can't speak and actually participate in the way I can give advice and help, but I can't speak for a different set of interests or represent, talk about the human rights issues in that same way. That means that even that just the existence of those institutions will privilege government, and there will always be, maybe not always, but at least for the foreseeable future, I think there will be a pull to migrate certain issues to those fora. Because there will be governments that say this is where we want to be discussing these issues. And we saw, I think there was a lot. I think time will tell the actual reaction to the ITU meeting. I think it's far too soon to really know long term. But there was progress on openness and on transparency and participation, but it was limited, right? And so the council working group issue is one. The fact that other stakeholders can give input on the council working group of the internet is great, but the fact is that they're not in the room when the decisions are necessarily being made. The conversations about access to documents and access to the meetings still give the governments the ability to decide what and how this happens and on their terms. And, fundamentally, these are negotiations. So there's even the governments that I think were saying the right things a lot of the time. And I think that many of the European governments and the U.S. government were pushing for the multi-stakeholder model in a lot of ways there. Doesn't mean that that's actually, a reality when the meeting ends. And so I think that is going to be a tension that's going to continue to exist, even as even as there are all of these other forums, and even as we have the Internet Governance Forum, where you see people sort of on an equal footing and speaking, that there are institutions that are only government institutions, essentially.
Andrea.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few points on your question, Susan, also on the basis of what my colleagues have commented so far. The first is that I think, and I've been thinking for a long time, that one of the main issues is that we use the same term, multi-stakeholder governance or multi-stakeholderism, but the reality is that around the world and across different stakeholders, we mean different things. And after all these years, we are not yet clear, or maybe we don't want to be clear, that I don't know, in Europe we have this terminology of creative ambiguity. Some people see multi-stakeholderism as the maximum transparency in the discussion phase. Some see it as having the maximum possibility of having input in the discussion, in the decisions. Some others see multi-stakeholderism as everybody should be on equal footing in the decision itself. I'm not taking any particular position on this, simply to observe that until we come to some kind of common good practices of what the term means, we are bound to continue having this discussion. And I don't know you, but frankly, after more than 10 years, I'd rather discuss about something else than about the meaning of multi-stakeholderism. I think it's high time that we move to some more substantive discussions. Secondly, when we talk about equal footing, which is another of the kind of holy terms that is often used in the internet governance discussions, which I actually learned comes from a US constitutional theory. It was first used there, and I will not bore you with what it means. It means a different thing, the way that people use it in the internet governance discussion, but be it as it may, there a word of caution. Let's be careful what we ask for, because if we're asking for equal footing in decisions, that is to say that businesses, and I'm not saying this to criticize businesses per se, but we need to realize that an equal footing in decision-making means that businesses have the same prerogatives and rights and powers to take decisions that impact on the lives of citizens than governments or the parliaments or your Congress or the legislative. Fine. But then let's not forget that, just to give an example, businesses have no obligation under international human rights law. They are not bound by international human rights law. States are. The governments of those states are. And when those states take those decisions, then there are instruments which we may discuss. Are they good enough? Are they enforced well enough? That is a discussion that we should have. But the point is that when a business takes a decision which you might argue violates Article so-and-so of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you have no standing to bring into court because it is not a state. And similarly, a business has no obligation to, for example, safeguard an equal representation of all the different interests. A government does. A parliament does. Again, we might argue that our current governments and parliaments, except the European Union, of course, which is absolutely perfect from this point of view, but except that I'm always conscious I have this camera in front of me, so I'm always conscious that I'm being video recorded, but let's be realistic. Yes, we can be better, but at least we have the constitutional basis to, as citizens, to request that discussion and that improvements be made. And one last point, perhaps to build a bridge, and this is a position that the Commission took officially in February 2014 when we adopted our kind of strategic policy vision for internet governance. And one point that we made, and we were quite happy to see that it was also made at the Net Mundial meeting in April 2014 in Sao Paulo, is that maybe a way to cross this bridge between people who talk about multi-stakeholder participation in different ways, people who fetishize at a certain point the idea of democracy, forgetting that democracy in theory is very good, but in practice in different parts of the world, every state considers itself democratic. No state is going to come to you and tell you, I'm not a democratic state, but the practice is very different from one side of the world to the other. And maybe a way to cross that bridge between the people who are more into internet governance and multi-stakeholder systems and the people who come from the more state-centered tradition, if you want to call it that way, is to invest a lot more into talking with groups and communities which have been working on participatory democracy. The internet can and should be used to increase the participation of citizens in the decision. We have many examples of that. David mentioned Brazil. Brazil is a country which has a strong tradition of multi-stakeholder participation in internet decisions through its CGI, its Internet Steering Committee. And people have been talking a lot about the Marco Civil, this Brazilian framework law which covers a lot of issues related to the internet. And what Brazil did was to use a lot of practices, processes, and technologies of participative democracy to ensure that when at the end the parliament, the Brazilian Congress, adopted the law, and again, it was the Congress that adopted the law, because that is the way that democracies work, I would say, but that was made on the basis of at least a year, if not more, at least a year long involvement of citizens. And that is where I think we should go. The sad reality, and I close here, the sad reality is that the internet governance world and the whole huge community of participatory democracy experts, they don't talk to one another. They don't know each other, and that is where, in my view, and again, this is an official position of the European Commission, this is where we should push and we should work a lot more. And maybe by doing this, we can forget a little bit about the terminological discussions and focus on the substance, on what we want to achieve, on which I think, certainly the people around this table and probably in the room, we all agree on what we want to achieve. And maybe the discussion of the terminology is simply, if I may, even in front of the camera, is just making us lose time at the end of the day.
Thank you so much for those comments. I was going to ask one more question about human rights, but because of the time, we're going to open the floor up for your questions now. So who would like to go first? I forgot your name.
Carrie.
Carrie.
My name is David Catton. I'm Carrie Guerra from the Center for Copyright Integrity. I'm involved in, I don't know if you want to call me stakeholder or not, but I know some numbers that we don't quite hear. You sort of broached off. There's 7 billion people in the world, a handful of anonymous people who are interconnected to the internet who don't know each other are involved in making decisions for these 7 billion people. ICANN is run by a board, and the board says, give me contributions in terms of comments, but we're going to do what we want to do otherwise. This is not neutrality. And it's quite fearful not knowing what's going to happen with IANA when it leaves America. And it hasn't been decided. I know that ICANN is promoting that as of last March. The government, the US government said we're letting it go. That has not happened. Carrie, can you ask a question? So I'm quite fearful. We have 7 billion people and a handful of undisclosed people who use names like Mickey Mouse are making these decisions. And I'm just your opinions on these facts.
Does anyone want to comment on that?
I will take that. I can't say, to be absolutely honest, that I'm sure I understood your question, but I will comment on what you said. I will do my own way, so you will tell me if that is satisfactory or not. The main point I would make is that ICANN and the European Commission, the European Union has been saying that for a long time, even when it was alone in saying that, but right now we're not alone anymore. ICANN has to make further steps, especially in a moment in which it is bound to lose that kind of relationship that it had with the US government, which could be criticized on the one hand, but then again, let's be very practical, it was one way in which a certain pressure could be put on ICANN not to go too overboard, let's say, in its decisions. So ICANN has to demonstrate more maturity in the way that it is accountable to the broader global community, in the way in which it handles, for example, the management of the so-called who is data, which I suspect is what you were referring to when you talk about people that register domain names calling themselves Mickey Mouse. There is clearly a law enforcement angle there because domain names are being used for criminal activity online, and law enforcement authorities have the right to be given the tools to investigate and to prosecute the use of those domain names. And ICANN has been, I would say, relatively, it has done a lot of work there, but we have not seen a lot of change. So my reaction, my comment to your point is simply that we are very, we are a government, so we're never optimistic by nature, but we are very, we do hope that the steps that ICANN is taking in terms of increasing its accountability as an organization of the board or the various sub-committees that compose ICANN, of the processes that lead to decision, will be strengthened.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay, we have lots of questions. Let's begin here. Sir? She'll bring you the microphone.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent for Europolitics. I think Mr. Guerra mentioned the point that I wanted to raise. With the change in Congress, the Republicans now in charge of both houses, do you think that that the debate is going to change on the issue of ICANN, particularly that more pressure will come to maintain the contract or to extend it so that the US government maintains some supervisory role?
I'm happy to make some comments, but we'll also want some of my colleagues. I'm Canadian, so I'll have a little slightly different focus. But I think, as I was trying to make in my comments, is that it's an issue that has come up in this previous Congress. There were some proposals of Congress to defund NTIA, I think. I don't think it made it to the floor. And I think it'll be very important because the IANA transition is a key process that's working its way through, that the community involved in internet governance has a lot of support for. And I think it will be very important to see not just the State Department and Commerce and others, but it'll be a real test to see if the multi-stakeholder community, if whether that's going to change or not. There are some in Congress that have expressed concerns one way or another, and I think it's something to watch out for. I'll leave it for other colleagues just to see what's going to happen, but I think that when issues, as long as that discussion can be protected. And so, for example, on the issue of internet freedom, regardless of what administration has been in, there has been very strong support. Both sides of the aisle, I think every year for the last almost 6 or 7 years, have funded internet freedom about $25 million. It's been an issue where there's been consensus. And so I'm hoping that we see that going forward, but I'll defer to others who maybe are tracking that a bit more closely.
Please.
One of the really nice aspects of being involved in this particular policy field is how much bipartisan support there is for the U.S. position on internet governance. And I first really noticed that right before the wicket, when both the House and the Senate passed a resolution, basically unanimously, that kind of signified support for the multi-stakeholder model, for the U.S. delegation that was heading to Dubai. And they had there was a hearing in the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee. I would definitely recommend people who are interested in this issue to look that video up, because I think it's really kind of, it's really quite amazing, particularly because the atmosphere on the Hill is so political and so, if I can say, toxic on other issues with not much areas for agreement. Here, we actually enjoy a really nice level of bipartisan support on issues generally. And even at this recent conference that we had in Busan, Korea, the IT Plenipotentiary, we had a very strong delegation from the Hill that attended as a Hill Del, and both from Republican side and from Democrat side, both on the Senate and the House. And it was very constructive, very positive discussion, because again, we do have a lot of symmetry here, regardless of your political party, on what the overall outcomes are, what we're hoping for in terms of preserving the multi-stakeholder model, internet freedom, internet openness. There are, of course, as Robert has flagged and as you have flagged, these legislative measures that are pending in the House and the Senate. But and we'll have to see kind of where the legislative debate goes. But just given my awareness, and when I worked on the Hill, I knew about the filibuster rule, which means you need over 60 senators to get any sort of thing out of the Senate, or just based on the level of major overwhelming support you need to actually pass congressional legislation like that. I think it's probably unlikely. However, I think it's really important on all of us, all stakeholders, to really get this IANA transition correct and get it right, and really make sure that we are comfortable kind of with the outcomes. There are clear dates that have been set forth for measuring our progress, and I think that's really going to be a real important indicator of whether or not we see any future legislative action or not. Is how do we manage this current IANA transition process up until 2015, 2016, because that will then be an indicator of whether or not there's more support for the transition or less.
I would just add, I think Manu's correct that we've seen some very strong bipartisan and unanimous shows of support for the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance and for these internet freedom issues. But we have also seen what happened this spring, and we've seen the .com Act, which did actually get adopted onto the NDAA. For the next fiscal year, which would, which requests a GAO report to examine the IANA transition and has the potential for delay. And I think the goals that were stated in the act and that have, the statements that came out were consistent with previous statements about internet freedom and about recognizing the importance of these issues. I think that what actually happened in practice in that act runs directly counter to those goals. And we have this risk of Congress interfering with a multi-stakeholder process in a way that is not necessarily productive, and in a way that didn't get a lot of attention here in the United States, but did spark a lot of reaction outside of the United States. The sort of question of, we announced this intent to transition the IANA function, and then Congress came in and started, talking about a UN takeover of the internet again and giving up control to Russia and China, and that just didn't quite compute to a lot of people. So I think from my perspective, sort of falling somewhere in the middle, that there's a lot of potential with a new Congress still to support many of these issues and to see good things coming out, but there's also sort of an unknown factor. And some of that is, in instances like this, and some of that is just, I think, doing a better job of actually the public education side of this and kind of making clear how these issues intersect and talking about the important steps and making sure that we're getting it right and that that's being well communicated. But I think that sort of, it is definitely an issue to watch with the new Congress and to see sort of what happens.
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Marie Thompson. I'm with ISOC DC, and I wanted to go off of your comment, Andrea, about corporations being beholden to international human rights law, and it posed a question of why wouldn't we want, if corporations and companies are going to be equal stakeholders in internet governance, to have them have that responsibility to comply with international human rights laws.
I will have a first reaction, then of course people should feel free to react further. I simply described a factual situation. I was not expressing a normative wish whether companies should or should not be subject to international human rights law. That is simply a fact that today they're not. Having said that, this again demonstrates the importance of reaching out beyond our communities. Because when you have these discussions in places like the discussion on the impact of human rights law on the operations of an internet governance organization or internet organization, when you, for example, have this sort of discussion within ICANN, and I have, by the way, sat on the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN for a number of years, so I know the organization quite well and the people in that organization. Normally, you're met with, by the staff and by a number of the people in the various supporting organizations, etc. You're met with, they don't quite understand what you're talking about, because that is not necessarily the core expertise of ICANN, nor should it be, to be clear. However, we are lucky because while ICANN has been doing its job, ICANN or the IGF or other organizations, In the United Nations, as many of you will know, there has been a multi-year-long debate on the so-called UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Ruggie framework from Professor Ruggie, who spearheaded that effort. Now, that framework clearly offers some very clear principles and implementing guidelines on how we should handle the relationship between businesses and human rights. And by the way, the European Commission, and that was one of the last projects that I worked on before being transferred here to DC, and it's one of the projects that I personally feel closer to. The European Commission has been working with many stakeholders on offering a kind of more detailed guidelines on how ICT companies should implement the Ruggie framework, the UN framework for business and human rights. So we have the possibility to do that. Legally speaking, the situation as of today is such that companies are still not legally bound by international human rights law. But if they wish, and you could argue that from many points of view, it is in the business interest of companies to do that, if they wish to follow international human rights law, then you do have efforts, you do have guidelines, you do have implementation suggestions on how to do that. The problem is, to be absolutely blunt, that I think with the exception of ISOC has been doing quite some good work on this intersection between internet and human rights. With the exception of ISOC, it's very difficult to talk to so-called internet organizations or the internet startups or the internet businesses and find that they even know about these other discussions. Again, I insist, and sorry to repeat myself, but I insist on the importance of building these bridges between the different communities, not reinventing the wheel, not coming up with something new that has already been discussed elsewhere, but just make the effort to go and reach out even to organizations that maybe, such as the United Nations, that maybe some of the internet organizations do not particularly like to talk to. But not everything that comes from the United Nations is by definition bad or evil or is trying to overtake the internet. Most of the time is not, I can assure you.
Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Chris Walker at the National Endowment for Democracy. David Gross observed that as the internet has become more influential in political, social, and economic life, governments will invariably become more interested in exerting control over it. One of the developments in recent years has been that a subset of governments have become far more adept at shaping governance in a range of ways. So beyond the internet sphere, you see this in governance bodies. It's the supranational level in Europe and Eurasia. You see this in Latin America. I'm curious for, perhaps David Gross would start, but others, what sort of checks or what sort of forces will prevent China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all of which have shown an interest in shaping internet policy, not with success necessarily just yet. The interest is there. The relative strength of these governments to exert influence is growing in a multi-stakeholder context where power will be diffused in key areas of internet governance. What are the natural checks or forces that will prevent the worst outcomes, some of which I think Robert alluded to in his comments, from taking hold over time?
Well, this is going to be, I think, an ongoing, very, very important issue. It's not a new one, and it will be with us, I think, for at least the foreseeable future, if not further. Make no mistake, no one should make the mistake that a good number of governments have a fundamentally different view of the role of the internet in their societies than the U.S. government and Europe, if I may suggest, have, and a number of other governments. In answer to your question, I think the answer is one of being clear for those governments who believe in the importance and the incredible transformational difference that the internet is as compared to any other form of communications and the like, that it is fundamentally different, that its impact is fundamentally different, and that we should be clear, our government should be clear, our government should be unified in order to articulate and stand strong on these issues, because clearly others will fight against it. This is where, in some of the comments we've heard, this is where I think the United States has been at its greatest, and it's certainly at its most bipartisan. since at least the Clinton administration, one might go further back, but you don't really need to, since the Clinton administration, throughout, there has been an underlying philosophical and political decision that the internet is fundamentally different and should be protected, should be encouraged, should in fact be globalized. The results of that have been extraordinarily powerful and positive. I am concerned that may be breaking down. And we see that on issues like net neutrality. Now, as an international guy, I'm not here to take one side or another on the net neutrality debate. But I was concerned, I will tell you, about the president saying that net neutrality is real, that the internet, for purposes of net neutrality, is really at its core no different than telephony. I mean, he has a paragraph in there, which I'll just read the first part of it, because I think it's for me, it's extraordinary, because it's a tremendous break from where the United States has been on the past, of which net neutrality is not a break. I mean, that's a different issue. But he says that the rules must be built on the lessons of the past. For almost a century, our law has recognized that for almost a century, so that's telephony, that's not the internet, that have recognized that companies who connect you to the world have special obligations not to exploit the monopoly they enjoy over access in and to your home and business. That's why a phone call from a consumer of one phone company can reliably reach another. So he's analogizing that the internet is like telecommunications. That at its core is exactly the argument that governments around the world that are on the other side of the issue of the transformational power of the internet have taken. That in fact, telephony, which is traditionally a very, not only state-interested, but state-controlled enterprise for most of its history, that it's the same. This is the sort of thing that I think can split us apart rather than bring us together. And traditionally, on internet-related issues, we, the United States at least, have been extraordinarily unified on these things. That's where I think we're going to have to come together. I don't want to say it has to do with net neutrality, because that's a different issue. Reasonable people are on different sides of that. But the idea of analogizing the internet and saying it's basically like telephony is, I think, the recipe for a problem for us internationally.
I just want to maybe comment, maybe adding something else as well. Something else one that needs to look out for is also the demographic transformation and who's coming online. And so for the vast part, we've had like-minded countries going on the internet. The next couple of billion online are going to be coming from parts of the world where governance is a bit more fragile, and institutions and rule of law is a bit more fragile. And how governments and how the internet's configured there are going to drive also the standards and the equipment that the rest of us use as well. So I think that we need to take a look at demographic of internet users over the next decade and see what that goes. And I think a key point that is really key to make sure is protected is the issue of technology standards, making sure that they're open and transparent, and that the issue of human rights impacts in regards to how the standards are built and what they allow for is key if we don't get it right. And an issue that's not come up as much, but also how challenges in regards to national security and the internet and surveillance are dealt with in the US, in like-minded democracies. Whether we can strike a right balance is also going to be an example for the rest of the world. If we figure out a way to solve the issue, or at least to have a conversation, then we can show there's a way to go. Because right now, I think the conversation's really shifted in the favor of others that are in favor of surveillance and national security, and we're losing that fight. So I think we need to set the moral high ground, and we need to set also the technology high ground going forward.
And be as consistent as possible. Andrea.
I'm sorry to take again the floor, but this is an extremely interesting question which would deserve a lot more time than we have, and maybe we'll have the occasion. But just a few points. I do agree with Robert that we need to keep the moral high ground, even though I think that at the end of the day we also need to be a bit rational about it, and some of the some of the less democratic countries, let's call it this way, in the world do not necessarily wait for the US or the EU to do one thing rather than another to take whatever decision they want to take. But having said this, my experience is that what is really very important is to understand that in agreement with David, that there are fundamental disagreements in the world between countries and also between private businesses on how to approach the internet and what the internet should be managed, should be handled, what are the limits, etc. But there are a lot of, and I will refer only to countries in this moment just to simplify, but there are really a lot of countries in this moment that simply have not yet taken a decision, have not yet decided whether they want to go to simplify the open multi-stakeholder way or they want to go the more closed and restricted way. I purposefully not using names of countries to qualify the two positions because they will put me in front of a video camera, will put me in a difficult situation. The worst thing that you can do once you realize that there are countries which are in the middle that have not yet taken this decision, the worst thing that you can do is to go to those countries and tell them, you had to do this because. You had to do this because we do it and therefore it's the right thing to do for you. That doesn't work because what we need to realize is that there might be good reasons why some of these countries have decided that for them at that particular point in time, a more close approach to the internet is the way to go. I will make you one example. If you're a country that already has a weak governance system at the national level because you don't have enough money, because of your history, whatever it is, and you already struggle to enforce your own laws within your territory with the administrative structures that you have, and then all at once there comes a technology through which things that are crimes in your territory are completely out of your reach because they are jurisdictional in another country, then you might nurture some suspicions. Now, you might argue that yes, but you also get a lot of advantages out of the technology, and that is where there needs to be a dialogue, there needs to be a debate. But keeping always in mind what is the interest of your counterpart, not your own interest. That, I think, is the best approach when you need to counter. You did mention a number of countries, so I will refer to those countries without mentioning them myself. The best way to counter those countries is to have the same dialogue, which quite frankly, those countries are having with their satellites, with other parts of the world. Those countries are investing a lot in Africa, for example, in the Central Asian republics, and they're having, give or take, they're having a relationship with those countries, which is quite frankly, or at least that the recipients of that treatment consider more egalitarian than the one that in this particular topic they have received from the US and Europe so far. That is where we have to invest. Perhaps we need to be more respectful in understanding what are the needs of all those countries and convince them that our way, and I fully agree with David, by the way, Europe and the US, in my view, with some very tiny differences that are not even worth spending all the time that will be spent on discussing, we are on the same line. We need to learn, sorry to be blunt, but we need to learn to go to the countries that are yet undecided and convince them that that is in their interest to go our way. And that will takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of time, and takes investments. My personal opinion is that that is where we need to invest the most, to counter exactly the effects that you are fearing.
Yes, sir. You're very enthusiastic. We'll try to fit both of you in, sir. Yeah, go ahead, please. Make your questions quick because we're...
My name is Safili, a student of Dubai University from Sierra Leone, West Africa. I wish to express my profound thanks to the Internet Governance Forum. The continent of Africa. How will the Internet Governance Forum strengthen the Internet and develop the platform? Now we have various governments of Africa that their internet capacity is weak. And those governments, their human rights records are not good. But the internet should play a vital role. And the people need the internet. So how will the internet governance help the continent of Africa to strengthen the free flow of information? This is my question.
Who would like to?
Sounds like a Manu question.
Thank you for your question. I think we all agree with you and your sentiment that the internet governance institutions need to look at these challenges of internet access, internet affordability, internet openness, all throughout the world, but in particularly the places that you mentioned in Africa. what our message as the U.S. government is that this is a shared responsibility. This is not just a responsibility of governments. This is a responsibility of industry, of civil society, of governments to really prioritize internet access, internet openness to all parts of society. One of the useful mechanisms of this Internet Governance Forum is that they have regional and national IGFs. So they have an IGF that happened in Kenya and many parts of Africa, South Africa. And these are sometimes really good forums for US industry or just industry to talk to local and regional leaders and think through some of these difficult questions. And that's what it's really designed to do, to really kind of take advantage of these forums to find common sense solutions to these broadband access, broadband affordability problems. And what we've started to do at the State Department is also send representatives from USAID to attend these meetings to talk about the programs that we as the US government have that foster public-private collaboration and also provide funds for broadband access. One such program that's actually really noteworthy is the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which has had a proven track record with many African countries now as sponsors. And so there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of work to do. Mobile is increasingly important for internet access, and mobile companies are really important players. But I think our hope is that we all recognize a shared responsibility, not just governments, but also industry, NGOs, other leaders in trying to really tackle these problems and taking advantage of these internet governance forums to really find common sense solutions. Because I think that's the best way to preserve the internet's future, is to solve some of these problems as a community.
So you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. Phil Corwin with Virtual Law, and speaking in personal capacity. Quick comment on the change
No
in...
comments, questions.
Okay,
One
question.
minute.
What happened to surveillance? If we had been here a year ago, all we would have talked about was Snowden. The president of Brazil would have just given a pretty active speech at the UN. The chairman, the CEO of ICANN would have just asked her to hold Nut Mundial. Early this year, the UN announced the IANA transition. A month before Nut Mundial, a lot of people thought there was a connection there to kind of tone down what happened there. But lately, here we are. There's been no direct discussion of surveillance. All I've seen in the papers lately are op-eds by U.S. and British law enforcement officials criticizing technology companies for introducing new encryption methods into their products. Is that just an issue that's where the countries are, where domestic populations will need to get whatever protection they can get from their own legislatures, but at the international level, intelligence agencies are going to conduct espionage over the net, and whatever protection there is going to be technological, or is this still an active issue at the IGF and any other forums that are discussing internet governance and human rights?
Danielle?
Sure, I can take that. So I think, first of all, surveillance definitely hasn't gone away as an issue, and it's, you're correct that a year ago it would have been the only thing we talked about, and I think that is to a fault. I think that was one of the problems in 2013 was that after the Snowden revelations, it was impossible to have a conversation about anything without surveillance coming up, and that I think it's an incredibly important issue, but there are a lot of incredibly important issues, and so having that be the only topic of conversation and be sort of a source of gridlock was, I think, a huge challenge. And so I think that's important to say. I think also there's lots going on sort of around the world here in the United States, obviously, even right now on surveillance reform. I think they're talking about USA Freedom this week on the Hill. And we are seeing this be discussed in the UN General Assembly and in other areas. It came up in Busan, but it came up in, sort of a way that it was clear some governments brought in references to surveillance, to interference from other governments, or sort of recognizing the right to privacy. Most of those references did not end up in the final language, and I think the consensus was reached not because it's not an important issue, but because the ITU wasn't the appropriate place to discuss that issue, and that was sort of the sentiment that came out of the discussion. It doesn't mean that this is not an incredibly important issue, nor does it mean, and this is something that we've worked on in my organization a lot, is looking at the cost of the surveillance, both economically and in terms of how it actually impacts U.S. foreign policy objectives and other foreign policy objectives. But it is a very complicated issue. It's not something that that can be the only thing that we discuss until we solve it, because it's very clear that these issues are not going away. There's not a short-term fix for a lot of this. I think you'll see a lot of conversations in the next year more about how we deal with surveillance, and that will be one of the big questions in terms of how the multi-stakeholder model evolves. It's pretty clear in the past year and a half, it's become pretty clear that you can't just push for things to stay exactly the same. I think that worked for a long time from a lot of the Western governments to come out in favor of the multi-stakeholder model and the status quo, and to say this is where we want to be, and this is actually good for the internet, and that doesn't address surveillance very well. So I think we will see things start to change as people continue to force the conversation, but I think it won't be the only thing that we discuss going forward.
Thank you. Very briefly.
Very briefly, because we're out of time. 2 points. One, on surveillance, great credit to Manu, Ambassador Sepulveda, and the leadership of the U.S. delegation in Busan at the Plenipotentiary for making sure we did not have a bad outcome on this. It was not an easy issue. It was critically important, and they did a terrific, terrific job of making sure that we did not have a bad outcome there. Second, perhaps to bring it full circle to Manu's opening comments, WSIS plus 10, this is the WSIS document, so WSIS plus 10, it will be back at the United Nations. So it's one more reason why next year will be so exciting.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for attending. I want to let you know our next event will be December 1st, and that will be on the trusted environment for the internet. So please stick around, and if you have any questions you want to ask our speakers, some of them have to go, but here they are. Thank you again for coming. Thank you guys so much.